the mine hunters, I think, are pretty key. Um, the use of mines by Russians on land has been, staggering. It even makes the use of mines in the Second World War, say in the fight around Tobruk, pale into insignificance. There are millions and millions of mines on the ground that have really affected the land war significantly. One assumes that there are equally amount of mines around the Crimea to prevent any Ukraine maritime force getting there. In order for them to be able to land, those mines would have to be cleared. Without the mine hunters, that is not going to happen.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with retired British Army officer Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment. Hamish has served on operations during the First Gulf War in Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's commanded main battle tanks for around 24 years. Hamish, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us on Frontline.
Pleasure.
And now, with the ground war in Ukraine in a state of stasis, as the Ministry of Defence puts it at the moment, in the air, the scale and number of missile and drone attacks has taken us into an extremely destructive phase. How do you see the war at the moment and how it may be fought in the coming weeks?
Well, I think not unsurprisingly, in the depths of winter, we are seeing this sort of static front line with the Ukrainian forces on one side and the Russians on the other dug in. The actual active part of the conflict is very much the deep battle. And as you said, massive amounts of Russian drones and missiles firing deep into Ukraine, attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly the power grid. Only today we hear that a school has been hit. This is what sort of happened last winter as well. The Russian deep battle, trying to break the morale of the Ukrainian civilians. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, they're also conducting a deep battle too. We're hearing just today that Ukrainian forces or those people supporting Ukrainian forces destroying a significant Russian fighter jet, 1,000 miles into Russia. We're hearing about a lot of attacks in Crimea, and really Ukraine trying to break the logistic support for the Russians. But on the front line itself, it is fairly static. There has been quite a lot of fighting, particularly around Avdiivka and some other areas. But with the weather, that's to be expected, I think. The other significant part that's happened over the last few months and is still happening is the maritime war, if you like, in the Black Sea, which Ukraine, without a navy, but by using very imaginative means, attack drones, have been able to destroy a number of capital Russian ships, but most importantly, have moved the Black Sea fleet back to Russia, where it cannot affect operations in the Black Sea, which is one thing that's allowed the grain to flow, but also gives hope that in the spring, Ukraine will be able to dominate the Black Sea and use that to attack the Russian forces in Crimea and elsewhere, which they haven't been able to do hitherto.
Yeah, I'll ask you a little bit more about the story that you've written about later on, about the denial of two British mine hunters to actually access the Black Sea. But before that, just to continue a little bit more on the war in the air, the Ministry of Defence in Britain has, in its assessment, said that Russia has used a significant proportion of its missile stockpile in the attacks on Ukrainian cities. But their assessment was that the attacks have primarily targeted Ukraine's defence industry, in contrast to what other people are saying, that it's been attacking the critical infrastructure. What does this tell us? If they are using such a high number of their stockpile, missiles in their stockpile, what does it tell us about the Russian strategy at the moment? How do you understand it?
Well, I very much agree with the MOD's assessment. The missile fire has been fairly light over the last few months, so I think most people anticipated there would be this onslaught over the Christmas period and the sort of January-February period. We know that Ukraine is trying to up its industrial capacity. Russia is on a total war footing. They are throwing everything to their war effort, turning tractor factories into tank factories. The critical thing in the battle really is endurance, I think. It would seem that the Russians have ultimate endurance. They're prepared to lose tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops. They are appeared to lose thousands of tanks, but appear to be able to replace them. And the strategy out of the Kremlin seems to be to try and outlast Ukraine. Now, on Ukraine's perspective, it has been very well documented that support, material support, ammunition, tanks, aircraft are slowing down from the West. So the only way that Ukraine can counter that is to start to develop it themselves. Very significantly, we understand that the F-16s from Denmark and Holland and other countries are literally on the horizon. Now, they will be a tremendous boost, I expect. But on the other side, the air defense side, at the moment, I understand Ukraine is knocking out about 95% of missiles and drones that have been fired. But these are expensive air defense missiles, the Patriot batteries, and others. And Ukraine only has a finite supply. And what Russia is trying to do is use up all those air defense weapons so that it can start to have a real impact. So it is an absolute balance with Russia trying to attack Ukrainian military industries. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody at all, which is why it's so important that NATO countries and Western supporters of Ukraine keep that ammunition and everything else flowing, because if Ukraine does not prevail, we face the dreadful prospect of NATO actually having to get physically involved in the ground, possibly in Ukraine itself, by the end of this year.
Really, you think that is a realistic prospect?
I do, absolutely, and I am. I think it's a realistic prospect from what's happening on the ground. Russia is throwing everything at this, and the way things are folding out, particularly in the US and some European countries, we've got elections coming up. There is fatigue, and there is also a lot of focus on the Middle East at the moment. Now, that is a dreadful war, but I don't see the Middle East creating war in Europe. But if Russia prevails in Ukraine, and of course the first Russian boot that steps foot in a NATO country, and NATO countries are all around Ukraine, that would trigger Article 5, which could well bring NATO into direct conflict with Russia.
So when you say that there's a realistic prospect of NATO getting involved by the end of the year on the ground, where and what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is if Ukraine does not prevail and if Russia makes significant inroads into Ukraine, then we're in a desperate position where will Russia go next? Now, I agree with the Polish security minister that Russia will not stop at Ukraine. And the polls are very clear that if Russia extends beyond Ukraine, they will get involved. They are a NATO country. And if one believes in NATO, and I certainly do, and I believe in Article 5, NATO cannot sit back and allow Russia to expand further west than Ukraine. So I think it's so important that NATO leaders, political leaders in the US, the UK, and across Europe realize this. A lot of them are focused on other things at the moment, particularly their own re-election this year. But quite frankly, that could all be irrelevant if we're drawn into a wider conflict with Russia, which is possible if we don't supply Ukraine everything it needs to at least hold the Russians where they are at the moment.
On that note, you have written an article in a national British newspaper in which you address the issue that Turkey has refused passage through the Black Sea of 2 British donated mine hunters to Ukraine. And you say this brings Russia closer to war with NATO. Why?
I think the naval battle that Ukraine has fought in the Black Sea has been very significant, has really damaged Russia, has pushed their Black Sea fleet out of the battle, which Russia in the early part of the war was hugely significant to them. Now, the other part of this Because Ukraine doesn't really have a navy, the mine hunters being provided by the UK and the assault boats that have been provided by the UK and also Norway could be hugely significant because with Ukraine potentially having freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea, being able to move around the Black Sea as they like, unattacked by Russia, it then brings into play the opportunity to attack Crimea from the sea. Also, in the last few months, British Marines have trained over 1,000 Ukrainian Marines, and I believe also the Danes and the Dutch have done similar. So, Ukraine now has a very significant, what we call littoral force of Marines who can attack from the sea into the land. Now, they can only do that if they have the boats to be able to get across the Black Sea to Crimea to be able to do that. And the mine hunters are key by clearing any mines that might be around areas that they might want to attack in Crimea. I also think that the Turks, who are fully paid up members of NATO, their president, Erdogan, likes to or has been effective at negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. But sometimes one gets the feeling that they forget that they are a NATO country. Now, the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO was in the hands of Turkey. They have allowed Finland to join. It looks like they're going to allow Sweden to join. Therefore, the NATO flank in the north is very secure. However, the NATO flank in the south, which predominantly is where Turkey is less secure. And if Russia does decide to move further west, the Bosporus, the straits in Turkey that allow access to the Mediterranean, will be vital ground, and the Russians will want to take that. So there is, I think, a slight concern that Turkey's ambiguity in this might be encouraging Russia rather than deterring them. And I would hope that other NATO leaders remind President Erdogan that that is the case, that actually what he's doing by not allowing this maritime build-up for Ukraine will make Russia's position stronger rather than weaker.
It was always expected, though, that Turkey would call on the Montreux Convention, which actually blocks the passing through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits by vessels that are technically from warring countries or to be used by warring countries. Given that that was already expected, what is the intention and how soon could these vessels be actually used?
Well, if they can't get through the Bosphorus, then that is, they will not be used. However, the assault boats, which are much smaller boats, I imagine, I'm not a maritime expert, but I imagine they could be moved overland to be used for any maritime sort of assault force, the Marines that we've already talked about. But the mine hunters, I think, are pretty key. The use of mines by Russians on land has been, staggering. It even makes the use of mines in the Second World War, say in the fight around Tobruk, pale into insignificance. There are millions and millions of mines on the ground that have really affected the land war significantly. One assumes that there are equally amount of mines around the Crimea to prevent any Ukraine maritime force getting there. In order for them to be able to land, those mines would have to be cleared. Without the mine hunters, that is not going to happen. So they are hugely significant. At the moment, it looks like the Turks will stick to the Montreux Protocol, but one would hope that they will review it. That they were sticking to it originally on the whole, providing access for the grain ships. The grain ships are now moving to and fro across the Black Sea and providing a real lifeline for food in Africa, but also for money to Ukraine. So one would hope that they will look at this, because I mean, who else are they trying to prevent getting into the Black Sea? If they want to be even-handed, are we expecting Iranian warships to move into the Black Sea to support Russia? I really don't think we are. I mean, the Iranians are so focused on the fight with Hamas and Hezbollah at the moment to be able to look elsewhere, and also security in their own country. So, yeah, I can see the perhaps Erdogan is trying to be even-handed, but for me, he is sitting too rigidly on a fence that he shouldn't be on.
If we could turn our attention now to the ground war, and in particular, you mentioned earlier Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine, the first and main attack of Russia's third annual winter offensive. It's largely stalled, although there was a very minor advance by Russia reported yesterday. But President Zelensky felt secure enough in recent days, to visit the area and take a selfie close to the front line. Can you explain how the war has been fought in this area and why the Russians are finding it so difficult and are failing?
Avdiivka is a horrifically fascinating battle in this war, and I think the scale of casualties is almost unimaginable. If we hadn't had the First World War, if people like me were not now studying battles like Passchendaele and Cambrai, um, the Avdiivka war would be completely unexplainable. The casualty rates in Avdiivka over the last few months have been similar to Passchendaele and Verdun in the First World War, and not dissimilar. What we've seen is static infantry forces across each other. The Russians initially used armored forces, tanks, and armored personnel carriers to try and attack into Ukraine forces. These were then heavily attacked and destroyed in great numbers by drones and artillery, and also to extent Ukrainian tanks. The Russians, having failed with armor, what we call combined arms maneuver, had then just thrown troops, soldiers, into what has now become known as the meat grinder. And they have been, I think the last count I saw in the last couple of months, 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in a relatively small area. Now, on the converse, the Ukrainians have really played a very strategically, I think, mature battle here, because what we've seen is the Russian forces are advanced across predominantly open ground. Ukrainian forces have actually used some of their key Western equipments, and particularly the M2, the Bradley armored personnel carriers, which have a very significant 25 millimeter cannon on them. They have anti-tank guided weapons, and they are very well protected. And these have actually operated in what we call a counter attack type mode, and have very quickly charged into the mass of Russian forces, destroyed a lot of them, and supported by Leopard 2 tanks, the German tanks, from afar, from a sort of sniping role, and have been hugely effective. And one of the things that he's shown is, and we've talked about it before with Western armor, Western tanks are really designed on three principles: firepower, protection, and mobility. And protection is the thing that gives them the advantage against the Russians. So the Bradley and the Leopard 2 and the Challenger 2 are very well protected. They've taken a lot of hits from Russian armor. The crews have generally survived. If the tanks have been knocked out, they have been recovered and repaired. Whereas Russian tanks are all focused on firepower. That's the main gun, the 120 or 125 millimeter gun, and maneuver, the engines to move them around. But protection, which is, the Russians seem to be protecting their soldiers, is really a secondary concern for them, which is why they've lost so many soldiers and so many tanks. So the Russian tanks have been taken out very easily. And I think that's been a very salutary lesson, and something I'm sure that the MOD here in the UK are looking at it very closely. So in sum, really, in around Avdiivka and Stepov, what the Russians have done have just thrown human flesh into this sort of maelstrom of Ukrainian armor maneuvering around. So things haven't moved very far at all. But what the battlefield is absolutely strewn with is tens of thousands of dead Russians.
And do you expect much movement in this part of the front line in the months to come, or do you expect more of the same, that Russia will continue to throw soldiers into that area and Ukraine will continue to be able to resist and hold the ground?
Well, I think the Russians will continue what they're doing because they can't really do anything else. The MOD intelligence update a few weeks ago also stated that they believe that the Russians couldn't fight at night because they don't have enough night vision equipment to be able to do it. But more significant, the MOD is suggesting that Russian soldiers have so little training that they don't have the ability to do anything more than sit in a trench. To actually maneuver around in great numbers, it takes a lot of time. When I was commanding the Royal Tank Regiment, it took us about a year to train before we could actually do some of these maneuver operations. A lot of Russian soldiers, we understand, only have a couple of weeks training at best. So I don't think the Russians are going to change tack. I'm hoping the Ukrainians will for a number of reasons. And first of all, as we've mentioned, the F-16 fighters are due to arrive in significant numbers. What Ukraine has never had is air superiority. The Russians have always had air superiority, which means tanks moving around in the open are very susceptible to Russian fighters and Russian precision-guided artillery. Now, if those F-16s can get those Russian jets out of the air, then that allows the tanks and the armored forces to maneuver. The other significant piece to this is that actually the Ukraine armored forces have had about a year's training now. So, and what we've seen around Avdiivka is they really know what they're doing. Now, if this can be replicated in other areas across the front, I have some optimism. Allied to the fact of the maritime operations we were talking earlier, if a significant maritime force, we talk about 2,000 Marines, can get behind the massive Russian defenses into Crimea, if the F-16s can control the sky, there is the chance that the Ukrainian armored forces can make that significant breakthrough that we've been talking about for some time. But the conditions are now getting there. But it's absolutely essential that they have the ammunition to do it, which at the moment is in the balance.
You said that if the F-16s can control the skies, it's been so anticipated. How many will arrive? How soon? I mean, I don't know if it's possible to say, but how soon do you think they might be operational in Ukraine, and how many?
Well, again, I'm not an air expert, and I'm sort of reading the same intelligence that everybody else is. But I understand we're expecting the Ukrainians to get about 60 of these F-16s, in the next month or so. To me, that is a very significant number. We know that the Russians have taken a real hammering of their own jets, and are running out of jets and probably more importantly pilots who can fly them. So 60 would be a significant number. We understand that they are imminent. What the Ukrainians have been very good is in their operational security, as we call it. They nobody really knows how many Ukrainian soldiers or tanks or whatever have been killed or destroyed. And those of us who are monitoring it and the media who are covering it are all over it. So that's a bit of surprise. We know a lot more about the Russian casualties. So I think the Ukrainian operational security is very, very good. For all I know, and for all we know, those jets might well be in position or about ready to go. So I would anticipate a significant number being available in the next few weeks, I expect, rather than months. But I agree that the significant ground offensive is still some time away, not least because of the weather. Tanks and armored vehicles are very good about driving across muddy ground and all the rest of it, but there's only so much they can do, and also there are still those minefields to be broken and gone through. So I would expect it's still a couple of months before we could see a significant sort of advance, as it were. But I expect once those F-16s start taking on the Russians, then that will be a further psychological blow to Russian forces, and hopefully will create the conditions to allow a Ukrainian advance in the near future.
Those F-16s, to do what would be expected of them, would have to be coming with a range of supporting equipment, including the ability to defend against electronic warfare. To the layperson, can you just explain how electronic warfare has been used and what kind of range of capabilities each the Russians and the Ukrainians have in this war?
Yeah, electronic warfare is hardly the sort of Cinderella part of the battle. It is hugely significant. Everything works by electronics these days and by satellites, and the thousands of drones flying around rely on an electronic tether to tell them what to do and to release their munitions. So one of the key parts of any battle is if you can intercept and disrupt your enemy's ability to communicate with its troops and its equipment, you can have a huge impact. And my own experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, where terrorists were using roadside bombs set off by mobile phone signals and push-to-talk radios, our key defense about that was using electronic warfare to prevent that happening. What we understand and what we know the Russians are doing is they're using their own electronic warfare to affect drones moving around, creating surveillance. And there are also reports that they've managed to key into the HIMARS precision-guided missiles enough to put them off course by a couple of meters, so they miss their targets. In the last couple of days, people will have seen, particularly posted on Ukrainian military media sites, of Ukrainian drones and precision weapons taking out a lot of these Russian electronic warfare sites. I think it's something that has not been a focus. The Ukrainians hitherto have wanted bombs and bullets, but we now realize quite how significant the Russians have. And they've always been very good at this sort of electronic warfare. But one of the positives for the Ukrainians attacking them, these radar stations that throw up all this electronic mess, as it were, to disrupt drones and precision-guided missiles. The Ukrainians appear to know what they are and where they are, and are attacking them. But it is a significantly important thing. And defense against it, certainly my own experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, one liked to create an electronic umbrella around your tank or your soldiers so that you couldn't be affected by it. But this is sophisticated, expensive equipment, which I think, in the early part of the war was something the Ukrainians were not after. I bet they are now very much looking to that. And again, who controls the sky is important. Who controls the electronic spectrum is very important, and who controls the sea. Now, at the moment, the Ukrainians control the sea. The other parts of it are in the balance. So it's, if we can give them the advantage in that area, again, it creates the conditions to allow them to be successful.
And finally, Hamish, just looking ahead to 2024, how do you, the rest of the year, how do you expect it to progress, the war?
Well, it's going to progress in three ways, I expect, and those three ways are going to be determined by the support Ukraine gets, the political atmosphere around the world, particularly the Americans. We know their aid is dried up at the moment. If the Americans step out of this war, I'm really very, very concerned of what will happen to the Ukrainians. It'll either remain static, which is what sort of Putin wants, because he knows if we're still in this position, we're still talking the same in 12 months' time, then Ukraine has probably lost. We hope, in the best possible scenario, where Ukraine creates air superiority, Ukraine has the ability to attack deep into the Crimea, and Ukraine has the armored forces and ammunition to press through. One could see a major breakthrough with Ukraine retaking Crimea, and you know, one would presume that the Russians would then have to negotiate, and there would be a settlement. However, Putin and the Kremlin, it's not London, it's not Moscow, it's not Washington, rather, and trying to understand exactly the Russian psyche, one really has to study their history, and that would take us another hour to discuss it. So there is that position. That is what we would hope, that the Ukrainians will break through significantly, and there will be some sort of peace deal. If it's still static, or God forbid, if the Russians make progress, this time next year, it could well be British tanks and British boots that are preparing to go into Ukraine to fight the Russians, rather than the Ukrainians. And absolutely nobody wants that. So it's critical that our leaders keep up the support and momentum to Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine prevails on their own in this battle, rather than NATO having to get involved to make sure that Russia does not go any further west than it is at the moment.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer today, Mary Patterson, and to you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thank you. Bye-bye.